hitting record because today's webinar is being recorded and this will be shared online afterward. And so if you want to rewatch any part of today's event, or if you have any colleagues who might be interested in viewing it, we will be sure to have that link for you to watch afterward. Today's event is part of our Week Without Violence. And if you have any questions, we will try to get to those at the end. So please put those in the Q&A tab, which we will have down at the bottom of your screen. And we, as part of the Week Without Violence, we have a whole week's worth of activities shared. And there is a link in the chat right now that will have a link to our website where you can see recordings from our events on Monday and Tuesday, and also find registration links for the rest of our events this week. For the Week Without Violence, this is part of a global movement of YWCAs across the country and around the world to end violence against women and girls. Because at YWCA, we know that not all violence is acknowledged or responded to equally, and that some survivors go unrecognized altogether. So every year, we have 1 week in October, which is also Domestic Violence Awareness Month, set aside to celebrate Week Without Violence, to share information, stories, advocate, and more, all with the common goal in mind that together we can end gender-based violence. And so today's presentation, I'm very excited to introduce. It is about survivor-defendants in the criminal justice system. And it is a spotlight on a very unique partnership with YWCA and the King County Prosecutors Office that really works to better support survivor-defendants who are victims of abuse, who are also accused of a domestic violence-related crime. We have three wonderful speakers here to tell you more about this. We have Doris O'Neill, who is the director of YWCA's Gender-Based Violence Specialized Services. We have Bridget Griffin, who is our domestic violence community legal advocate. And we have David Martin, who is a senior deputy prosecutor with King County, who also serves as supervisor of King County King County Prosecutors Office Domestic Violence Unit. And so with that, I will turn it over to Doris and Bridget and David to give you all the information about Survivors First.
So good afternoon, everyone. So we are going to be talking about the Survivors First program. So the Survivors First program is a baby and a vision of Doris. So it's a partnership between the YWCA and the King County Prosecutors Office. The acronym FIRST, it actually stands for Facilitating Intervention and Resources for Survivors of Trauma. So our focus is when we get survivors is to help them walk them through these different processes. So a victim defendant. So if you're wondering what a victim defendant is, it's legally recognized as a survivor of domestic violence or gender-based violence. And she has been arrested and facing criminal charges. So we're going to turn it over to Doris. She's going to talk about the why.
So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Doris O'Neill, Director of Gender-Based Violence Services. And Survivors First project, as Bridget mentioned, is a project that was a partnership with with the King County Prosecutors Office. And the backstory of the why in this project is, as we focus on working with women of color, and specifically African-American women, we have found that is our most underserved community, underserved and underreported. And in identifying and addressing those unmet needs of criminalized survivors, meaning that a lot of times survivors will be arrested, although they may have been defending themselves at the same time. And we also know the racial disproportionalities of survivors of intimate partner violence in the criminal justice system. Some of the things that lead to them being in the system a little bit has to do with the mandatory arrests, where officers are mandated to make an arrest of, well, one party or the other. And sometimes if African-American women are in that position where the abusive person may have scratched, she may have scratched that person, or she may have tore the clothes of that person, the abusive person, while she was trying to defend herself. And so then police are called out, and at that time she may be arrested. We also understand that once African-American women, survivors, it's a different experience. We're gonna be talking about that a little bit more, but the legal problems that have a direct impact of their lives is family, healthcare, credit, housing, education, access to services. And so when we talk about why this project was so important, is that we have programs for different situations. We have programs for drug court, when people have addiction. We have mental health court. We even have batterers treatment. But we don't have a program or supportive services for survivors who have now are entangled with the criminal justice system because they're referred to as a defendant. And so it was very important in putting this project together and working with the prosecutor's office, really trying to say, okay, what services can we provide? And we'll be talking a little bit more about that also. Yeah.
Okay, sorry. So now we're gonna just kind of talk about some of the some of the things that Doris just talked about, survivors being in the system and there's not a lot of services for them. When they're arrested, survivors, especially African American and Black women, face quite a bit of barriers. And some of them, mostly that Black women are 30% higher. The domestic violence IBP is 30% higher in Black women than it is in white women. So they suffer or experience domestic violence at a higher level than other races, and namely white women. Domestic violence is the leading cause of death in Black women, African American women, between the ages of 15 and 45. Police response after calling 911, often survivors won't use the system. They won't call because they don't trust the police. So the police come, often they may be arrested or targeted as the victim, or stereotyped, as the next one says, as the angry Black woman, because they may be upset or they're expressing some emotion. And the police often don't see them as a victim. So that's often they're more likely to be arrested because they're not really viewed as a victim, and more likely to be arrested when charged, when seeking safety. So when they call 911, there's a bigger chance that they'll go to jail versus being protected when they're looking for help.
And once the cuffs goes on, life is never the same, and it affects them in a way that the consequences of once a survivor is booked into jail, that piece alone is scary. But then if there's a bail set, a majority of the time, one can't afford the bail. And so they will stay in jail longer, anywhere from 2 weeks difference from an arraignment to a pretrial hearing. During that time that they're in jail, they have now lost their jobs. And their gaining employment is a barrier because this charge is now on their record. In the event of that, they could also lose their housing and ineligible for housing because it's going to be on their background. And then they lose job, housing. There's a possibility if the children were involved in this incident that now they have to deal with Child Protective Services. And then the abuse take control again. So they're re-traumatized all over again, from the physical, verbal abuse to the abuse of dealing with the criminal justice system. And it is, when we look at working with women, we ask them, what are your barriers? And they'll say, well, I have a conviction on my record. And so then we'll ask, well, what happened to that? She said, well, I got charged with domestic violence because I hit my abuser back and he had a scar on his face. And then when the police came out, I was arrested. I was dragged out of my home in front of my children with no shoes on to being arrested, and the abusive person got to stay with my children. And then they entered a no contact order against me. So once I did get out of jail, I could not even go back home to, I could not even go back to my place of residence with my children because now there was a no contact order. So then we have the partnership, and David Martin with the King County Prosecutors Attorney's Office will be sharing on how the prosecutor's office came to this recognition that something needed to change. So would like to introduce David Martin.
Thanks, Doris. And thank you, Bridget, and to everybody on the call. I know there's some of my colleagues who are on the call, some people that I've known for a long time, like Tracy Orcutt. Our partner in funding this, the Victim of Crime Act, and their sponsors, Meta. So this is an amazing program, and one that I think is long overdue and is unique. There's not many programs like this that I know of nationally. And one of the things I think just that speaks to me about this effort is I've been doing domestic violence prosecution work for over 20 years, and I've known Doris most of that time. And we've worked with a lot of victims together. And it's not uncommon for victims to come back to the criminal justice system. And they come back a lot of times for domestic violence cases. And that's kind of what this program is a lot about. But that's not the only thing. Victims come back for drunk driving. They come back for substance abuse. They come back for other related things that are a byproduct of the trauma that they've gone through. And it is routine, as I think many on this call know. And what the research really tells us is that women in the justice system, specifically women of color, are there as a byproduct of the abuse that they've gone through. And then we ask the question, well, what is the justice system and what is the community really doing for them? There's a lot of conversations about reentry, and there's some great organizations doing reentry work. There's very little done on the front end. And there's very little done to work with people who are returning to the system. And I know for myself and my colleagues, for the many victims that we work with, and then you'll go to an arraignment calendar and you'll see a victim on an arraignment calendar who was your rape victim last year or your domestic violence victim the year before. And I think for too long, the system has compartmentalized that and said, oh, well, kind of you're in a different department, and so we're not going to be able to do anything for you. When there is much attention and focus given to so many others about different programs to help them out. And Doris was talking about some of those earlier. So the more and more that Doris and I and others talked about this, the more we realized there's an enormous, enormous need, because the vast majority of victims who are coming back to the justice system are people that have been worked with before, and there's a record of their victimization. And so this idea of kind of legally recognized victimization is an easy one for data systems and institutions like myself to deal with. But this program also involves folks who have the endorsement of a community-based organization as well, like the YWCA. So it's designed to provide a coordinated response. And I need to be clear that this is not a diversion program. We don't have funding for that because this is a Victim of Crime Act program. We can only help and work with former victim defendants who have been, and I think the term is deflected from the criminal justice system. So we're working with victims who criminal charges are not going to be filed against. And I think that's, it's a really amazing opportunity. And we have many stories of identifying victims, cases not being charged, but then for many years, no one was ever providing services to people in that moment. And now it really relied upon those victims being aggressively care-seeking or help-seeking to get what they really needed. And the difference in this program is the YWCA is reaching out to people on a referral from my office, and they're doing so in a really trauma-informed and proactive way, and it's made a huge difference. And this is how it works from the prosecutor's end. So we're trying to identify survivor defendants, evaluate those cases, and evaluate the evidence. My colleague Jill Yamamoto is on the phone, and Jill is one of our leads in doing this, and in addition to managing our domestic violence court. And so this has been really an ongoing process at the prosecutor's office, because we don't want to limit this just to the domestic violence unit. We want this to spread across our office and have prosecutors really know to look at this when they're looking at a case. It's very easy for prosecutors to be siloed and have tunnel vision and just say, okay, when I look at a case, I'm looking at the history of the individual as a defendant, and forget that there's also a history that's kept track of that individual as a victim. So there's great information that's there, and we want to evaluate the case holistically and with a great justice and equitable sense to make sure that we're looking at the case and capturing cases where there has been former victimization. And there's two paths that cases can go on. They can be filed or they can be declined. And this is an example of, at least as to here, is to file and decline. When we do file a case, there's a traditional route. And that's our hope, is that one day those cases that are going to be filed, cases whether it's a felony theft or a drunk driving or things like that, that one day we'll have diversion. This program is not diversion. I'm really hoping one day it advances to that. We have support from local government and state government to do it. And really right now this is focusing on decline cases. So under the Victim of Crime Act, that individual can still be labeled as a, quote, victim. And the YWCA can have the referral. So Bridget, if you could advance to the next slide. And here, the great advancement over the last couple of years is electronic records management. Previously, everything was done on paper. You had to collect files. You had to it was very laborious to really understand what was going on with anybody for anything. And here, this is an example of someone who is a defendant and victim on particular cases. So it'll say defendant, it says witness. So we will have all the times that a system has been connected to somebody and the type of case they've been connected to them on and who that person is. And this is really valuable information, because then you can say, oh, I'm working with an individual, I'm considering a case, but this individual was recently a rape victim, or they've been a victim of abuse or trafficking. I need to look at those files, see what has happened, and really have a holistic view of this individual before we make any decisions. And that's really important. So if you could advance the slide. And it tracks the type of individual. And the good part is that we can pull data out of this, and we can start to set up systems where we're identifying people right when they come to us. Who are the number of victims that we have who are coming to the prosecutor's office or being referred for criminal charges? I want to know that. I want to know what's happening with them. I want to be able to provide interventions to those folks. And if we actually step back even further from that and understand that this is done across the justice system. So if you could advance to the next slide. Oh, and keep going, and keep going. Here we are. So this is an example of the court's the administrative office of the court's record keeping system. And for those of you who don't work with records like this, these are criminal justice or legal records that prosecutors and other lawyers have access to, Criminal Justice Information Service. Over on the left-hand side, it notes where someone has been either a defendant or a victim, a petitioner, or a respondent, depending on the type of case. So the court system tracks this for everyone. And this is really important information to really understand how many times there are co-occurring instances of somebody being both a victim and a defendant. And this is powerful information that we're hoping to capitalize on in the future with this program. We've made a data request to the administrative office of the courts for 30 years worth of co-occurring victim and defendant data, because we know there are many former victims who have an opportunity to have their rights restored, but rarely are pursuing that process because there's no one to help them out. And so by reaching out to them, we can connect people to services through court records and help them into the process into the future. And here we have a victim who has been victimized repeatedly, right? In past felony cases, in past misdemeanor cases, over an extended period of time. And they've also, in this circumstance here in 2019, they've been potentially charged as a defendant. And as you see in the judgment, that case was dismissed. And so we have a case where we've identified someone who's been a former victim. They've come to us a defendant, no charges were sought, and now it's a referral to the YWCA. And so when we talk about individuals who are marginalized, right, the most marginalized are those who are coming back to the victims who are the most marginalized, are those who are coming back to the system as a byproduct of that trauma that they've been through, right? And they need to have assistance and they need to have help. And that's really the fantastic and amazing part of what the YWCA is doing here. So if we could advance the slide, please. Oh, and keep going. So here's another example of this information. Some of you may know that all court orders. So not only are we looking at just kind of criminal history, we're also looking at the civil history associated with people. So anytime somebody takes out a court order or is subject to a court order, that is tracked in the court system. No contact, protection orders, temporary orders, and what status they were within it. And this is another source of information that you can gather, and then you can start to identify individuals who are too often overlooked in this process. And I think it's a really important thing to do, to understand the data component of this, because if you don't count it, it doesn't matter. And here, the great part about this, and I believe the number is over 100 former victim defendants have been served by this effort just in the short period of time that it's been around. And it's a huge accomplishment. And we're hoping, that's just within my office, and hoping to partner with other jurisdictions to be able to do this as well.
Okay. Thank you.
So, thank you, Dave. Once the prosecutor has made their decision, they send us a referral. And in the referral, we will contact the survivor. And in doing so, I know traditional way is we have always, felt it was unsafe to contact the survivor, and we want the survivor to contact us. But in this case, the prosecutor's office is informing the victim in this case that they will be making a referral to the YWCA. So they kind of know we're gonna be calling. It's been very interesting since we started this project, because when we called some of the survivors, one particular, she put us off. She, okay, I'll call you back. And so I called her back maybe 3 or 4 days ago and was really trying to let her know that this program was created for her. Oh my goodness, I'm about to lose my, hold on. Sorry about that. Battery power low. Plugging in. Okay. technical difficulties. There we go. Okay, so so one of the things that the survivor said to me was when she finally did agree to come in to meet with us, and we were talking about how this program was really created with her in mind, she says, well, no one's ever reached out to me before. No one's ever tried to help me. I've been down this road before. No one's ever tried to help me. And so we're like, well, now we are here and we do want to help. And we supported her with being able to pay her rent, because that was something that she was dependent upon the abusive person. We provided DV advocacy. We talked about historical trauma, really set her up to where she had resources, community resources, she had information. This survivor is striving right now. And she has told us that it made a difference in her life that someone actually reached out to her and cared enough, non-judgmental, and provided culturally competent services, that somebody was in the seat that looked like her, that really made a difference for her. And so as we continue to work with survivors, we're hearing that quite a bit. And we're hearing, you know, well, they arrested me and it's because I had a scratch. And the trauma that comes when when they're arrested, like I said earlier, when the cuffs goes on, that it's a whole different experience, re-traumatizing the survivor, because all of the things, like I mentioned, going to jail, all the things, the barriers that they encounter. And so we do the outreach, we work with the survivor to evaluate what her needs are. And then there's service, and they can continue to utilize our services for as long as needed. And I have to say that I've heard from a lot of women of color of their fears of being involved in the system, their fears that I'm gonna lose my job, and some that have lost their jobs. And so the Survivors First Project is really supporting those that otherwise wouldn't get any support, because if they're a defendant, then they can't work with the prosecutors' advocates. And so it has been really important, and this project is striving, and we want to continue to provide services and services.
Doris, can I just weigh in, because I think it's such an important point, and one that, as this has gone on, I think is really, it's both kind of controversial in a way and an amazing adjustment that the Y has made, because so many of the former victims that we see in this program were not engaged in kind of this care-seeking, help-seeking, they'd just been booked into jail, and your efforts are right when people were being released. And I think we're hoping that one day we're going to get the Y into the jail so you can talk to people directly when they're in there, right in the process of being released, but to connect with them immediately, because so frequently people would not, that it wasn't the first thing on their mind to, now I'm going to reach out to a community-based agency. I'm going to go through that process with them. The fact that you reach out to people and you're proactive about it in a really warm and trauma-informed way is like, it's transformative for the people that you've been working with. And I'm just so impressed with the results that you've gotten taking that approach.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And a lot of times what survivors say too is that I didn't know about services. I didn't know anything about a DV advocate, because as women of color, a lot of times don't identify with the term of domestic violence, because they sometimes believe that domestic violence is only about physical abuse. And it is not only about physical abuse. And so it's really empowering to provide them with the information of the different type of abuses. And it's like, I've never heard of an advocate. I've never heard of advocacy. And so we're hearing that a lot. And it just really puts a smile on my face when they say that. And I said, well, you got it now, and we're going to support you through this process. So turn it back to Bridget, I believe.
Yes. Okay. So Survivors First program it really, really works. So my position, I'm the legal navigator. So my focus is to help navigate them through systems and processes and things that before they were trying to do it themselves, or they would go to this door and they would get shut down, maybe because they, had a drug problem, or there's, whatever it is, they didn't get the response that they needed or the help that they needed. But to have someone that can hold their hand just for a little while through the process, empower them, and then let their hands go, and then they can walk on their own and come back for maintenance. So they're allowed to be with us, meet with me as long as they want to. I want to talk about a success story, just one. So I have more than one, but this is one that I think it covered a lot of the areas that we provide for them. So we provide resources for housing, we would provide legal assistance, and resources for counseling and treatment and advocacy when they're dealing with CPS. And this survivor had all of those. And so when she was arrested for domestic violence, for fighting back, and the prosecutor reviewed the case, they went through that process, and they identified her as a victim defendant. They chose to dismiss her case, and they referred her to us. And so when I got the referral, I, connected with her, found out that her 3-year-old was still with the abuser, who was now had this tool to, okay, come back, just to kind of use. She went to jail, so he thinks he has something to hang over her head. So we came up with a safety plan. She had to pretend everything was okay. She went back home. We had a plan to, as she did that, we were looking for housing for her, shelters, a different place for her to go. So she went back. The next day, she decided, she just let them know that she had an appointment, took her son, and we were able to get her son and get her away from, the house. So as I was working with her, an opening came open for a transitional housing program. And she had disclosed that she was dealing with a chemical dependency issue. And this program specifically works with survivors that are survivors of domestic violence, and they want to deal with their outpatient chemical dependency. And so she was accepted. She got in there, and when she got in there, she actually cried. She was so happy. She had been going from house to house. She had actually sent me a video of somebody, her relative, screaming at her and putting her out. And so it was a lot of stuff she went through, with the weeks before we got her into that transitional housing program. But she said she slept comfortably for the first time in a long time. She said she didn't have to worry about where she's gonna go that night. She has food. She don't have to worry about if her baby is gonna be dealing with, a toxic atmosphere. So she really was so thankful. And so after she got into the transitional housing, she wanted to do a parenting plan, so that, and a protection order. So we did that. And she had CPS involvement. When she got into the transitional housing program, she had one child. The other child was still in the CPS process. So since then, she has worked towards getting both of her children with her. So they're with her while she's in this program, because it allows them to have their children while they're there. So that was such, it was such a powerful example of how this program worked. If she had not been referred to, Survivors First, if we hadn't reached out to her, because a lot of times they're a little hesitant when we reached out to them. Sometimes it takes more than one call, and so to gain their trust, or to believe that this is just not another, okay, person's gonna come and disappear, I won't hear from them again. So, and so it was very empowering for her to have these doors open for her to now deal with, an issue that she had been using as a Band-Aid so that she can cope with all the stuff she's been dealing with. And so, so that's one story. And
And Bridget, can I say just real
Yes.
quick that there's like nothing better for us at the prosecutor's office. I know Jill's on this line, and we send out sometimes when it's okay, we get updates from you about kind of how people are doing, and it's amazing the impact that has for all of us, knowing that people are going to get the help that they need. It's like such a powerful thing that the Y is doing. And there is this like energy surrounding it, which is, it makes you want to do it on every case, right? And that, and I think that's one of the things that's been hard, at least for me, and I know probably for you and Doris, is like, there's a question in the chat about diversion, and you just want to kind of keep doing more, right? You see these cases, you see the opportunities, you see what can happen if we just have the ability to kind of do more, not just in King County, but in other jurisdictions and other places. And I think that's kind of the up and down of this program. Like, you see this amazing work that you all are doing. You're like, well, we can do that over here too, but we're not there yet.
Right. So, and also we have a survivor speak. So they came back and they kind of shared with Doris, someone that shared with Doris, their response after receiving services. So the staff member at the YWCA was they shared that the staff member was very helpful. There was a nurturing, and they were very assertive. After telling my story to nurses and law enforcement and friends and relatives, I didn't seem to be heard until speaking with the staff member and with Doris. They displayed earnest empathy without a patronizing tone. I felt safe and well balanced after having an initial meeting. Since then, and I have communicated on a regular basis. So the other staff members. So, this was a survivor who came back and, shared how impactful, just like you was talking about, Dave, how impactful the interaction for somebody coming after them. Somebody's pretty much like tapping on the shoulder, wait, we'll talk to us. We'll see how we can help you. We have resources. And so when they finally, interacted and they received what, like she said, with the law enforcement, and, you get a lemon face with the law enforcement and the nurses, and everybody's kind of giving you a, next kind of attitude. But to have a response to where you felt welcome, you felt accepted, you felt like no matter what you came to the table with, you're not going to be, judged, but you're going to be treated like a person, and you're going to be looked at beyond your experiences. And, often I share with survivors that these experiences doesn't make who you are. These are experiences, and you can come out and be that empowered woman, that empowered person that you are, even before your, all these things kind of mask your identity. People see this, but it doesn't mean that's who you are. So for her to experience that, again, is very, very rewarding.
Yeah, Bridget, it just seems like, and I come back to this point because I think it's like a really kind of fundamental thing is, and I know on the criminal side, like one of the things that what you do with people is you hand them a list of phone numbers, and you're like, here's all these organizations, call one, right? And then people call, and they have to tell their story, and they have to go through intake, and sometimes they won't get a call. People are busy, right? It's a big, there's huge needs right now. And it's such a powerful thing. What you're talking about is reaching out to people, building trust with them, having a program specifically for them that's like really deeply culturally competent and it speaks the language and does so in a way of like, this is all about you. And it seems to go so far with so many people. It's amazing.
Yeah.
And one of the other things also is that when we're working with survivors and we're talking about the historical trauma that they have experienced or may have experienced, we're also talking about self-care, healthy relationship, because we know as many African-American women, healthcare is not always a top priority. And so we try to,
Right.
talk about loving ourselves from inside out. And then loving ourselves, we have to work on our insides of what's going on mentally, physically, in our bodies. And also because what we see too is we have African-American women are always identified as being the strong Black woman. And that title is good in some ways, but not always good, because by having that title, it's like we're inhuman. We don't have feelings, we're angry and all these things. And that is not the case, because, they're seeking services, but they're being judged by, sometimes if they're light-skinned or dark-skinned, they're being judged by their story. They're being judged um, how they express what they feel, and it can sound like, sometimes I've heard this, one of my staff say, she cussed me out. And I'm like, did she really cuss you out, or did she cuss at her situation? And it was really about her situation. And so in the way that one may express themselves, they're sometimes seen as the angry Black woman, but underneath all of that, there is a human being who wants to be respected and have the equity of receiving the same services that anyone else is entitled to. And so as we continue to do our support groups and our different services, because we have DV services, but we also have sexual assault services, we have legal services, we have children's services, we have housing services, community advocacy services. And so when we look at that holistic approach, she may, like Bridget identified earlier, she may need all of those things. And how hard is it to navigate each one of those systems that she needs to support her? And so that's where the help from Survivor First Advocate, our legal navigator Bridget, and myself, is that support is to help them navigate these many different systems. Oftentimes, CPS involvement, and it's not always culturally competent with some of the things that are asked of survivors. And they're required to jump through a lot of hoops, but there's not a lot of culturally competent services that go along with it. And so we at the Y, our focus population is African-American women, but we work with all women of color, and we work with all people who identify as a survivor of domestic violence. And that does mean if the victim is a male, yes, we will work with that person too. We work with our LGBTQ community and provide supportive services to all.
Doris, I have to ask you, I know when this first started, there were a lot of questions about focusing specifically kind of the priority of Black women in this program. And when that was, 14, 16 months ago, but you've held firm to that. And today, when we talk about this program, you did a presentation for my office, and we discussed this as being a program that's kind of unapologetically focused on Black women. And those barriers that you talked about, I mean, it's interesting for how long people have known about those. We're lucky to have a really great expert who's been helping out the Y and helping out this effort, Dr. Carolyn West from the University of Washington. Dr. West wrote an entire chapter about this, 25 years ago? All this research has been focused on the barriers and challenges that Black women face, and specifically as criminalized survivors, but there is no program to help, with the exception of what the Y is doing. I mean, how does that, I mean, like, how have you been able to make this work as a result?
Well, we look at the people who are further from population, which is our marginalized communities, and looking at from the people that we have served. I've been in the field for 20 plus years now, and looking at the people we serve, we hear the same stories all the time. I didn't know about services. No one talked to me about what was going on for me. I remember working with one young lady, and she was African-American young lady, and I asked her, called her by her name, and I said, so what do you want to do? And she burst out crying. And I said, you know, what are the tears for? And she said, nobody's called me by my name and asked me what I wanted to do. And that just like really stood out for me. And so knowing that African American women are the least protected, that we wanted to be that voice to support them and help them build their voice. And the pushback of, you know, why are we focusing on that? Because there's a deep unmet need, but also BIPOC, women of color, immigrant, refugee survivors, or Native or Hispanic survivors, it affects all of people of color. But I know specifically there's nothing designated just for African American women. Even when we started our sister circle for African American women, I got pushed back on that also. Why do Black women need to have their own group? And it was like, I was taken back by that. But when explaining that, because we need a space where we can be free to speak and process, because the experience that a white woman may have had with a police officer is going to look totally different sometimes for what a Black survivor may have experienced. And so we have to have that space so that we can talk about history, so we can talk about, you know, the religious piece, faith piece, there's understanding our Blackness as one. And so as we continue to do this, is where Dr. West has really been instrumental in supporting us, but to really have a curriculum and have a process so that we can empower women and empower our Black women to take a stand and have a voice in their lives. So like I tell people all the time, you're the driver, we're just the navigators. And so we want to support you and navigate through these systems. Okay. Bridget?
And
so we're going to be, all of our information will be posted on the website, but we wanted to open it up and have some time. And I think Keisha's going to be kind of putting the questions out there. If you have any questions, put them in the box and we'll go from there.
Yes, Doris, we have a lot of questions already. People are very interested in this subject. So starting off, David mentioned that this is not a diversion program. What can we all do to advocate for the Survivors First model to be adopted more widely?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think, you know, and I would love to hear Doris and the Y's response. I think there's a lot of things that people can do. One, just to bring attention to this. And I know there's a very intense conversation going on right now, an important one about what involvement anybody wants to have with the criminal justice system. And that's really important and is long overdue. But what's also true is, you know, there's just life that's happening right now. And people have been talking about victim defendants for decades. And I think eventually you have to stop talking and take action. I mean, this is October, right? It's Domestic Violence Awareness Month. We call it Take Action Month. So just saying like, you know what, we're going to go do something. And I think that was really at the heart of what we were trying to do, is like, we just didn't want to talk about it anymore. We want to help some people, want to do the work. It's not going to be perfect, but we've learned a lot just in the year that we've been doing it. And then you realize, well, like, gosh, well, we're just doing this on cases that charges are not being filed on. They're really important cases. What about those cases that, you know, we have a victim of sexual assault last year, and now she's got a substance abuse problem. She comes for a DUI. Wouldn't it be great to not charge that case at all, to have that be a diversion and just send her to a program like the YWCA? And I think really engaging people in the discussion of like, this is a unique and important group of people who deserves a lot of attention. Think of what we do as a community for veterans, right? Veterans have an entire levy dedicated to services for them, to those who are mentally ill, those who are substance abuse, like those who are like former victims of gender violence. Like, this is You know, like if you're criminally involved, like this is it, is this program. There's nothing else nationally. So I think just the ideas have to get out there. And then I think kind of just we need more people actively working in this space to make this a reality. And those who are doing diversion programs need to have some education regarding gender violence. There needs to be an exchange going back and forth. And I think for my colleagues who are prosecutors, they really need to be educated as well. And I've been trying to do that, as my colleagues Jill and Angie and others have, and Doris and Bridget have too. But I think there's a few of us, and we need more. We need more people who are bringing a good mind to this. There was a question also about kind of the records for people and record relief. That's something I'm really excited about, is how can we identify and take the same approach that the Y is doing of being proactive and a warm reach out to people about, hey, you're eligible to have your records expunged, to have your rights restored. Do you want to do that? You can do that for free. And I think that's really flipping the script, and you could help thousands of women. You could, if you just had the data, and we've requested it. And now it's, how do you manage that? How do you do that outreach? And what's the right way to do it in a culturally competent and sensitive and equitable way? And that's what's exciting about this program, is just all the places it could go. And I'm just happy to be a part of it with the Y.
Okay.
Doris or Bridget, do you have anything that you would like to add to that in terms of what can we do to advocate to have this model adopted more widely?
What we can do, we're really hoping that more municipalities and systems will understand the concept of victim defendants and survivor defendant, and to take on an approach to, let's look and see what else can this survivor benefit from, because jail is not beneficial. Having a criminal record is not beneficial to anyone. And so what we are trying to do is do a lot more, and what can be done is that a lot more people acknowledge that this program is a pilot, and it is being, you know, we are working on it and trying to get more and more courts and systems to acknowledge that this piece is what's missing. It's missing. And we need to try, if we're talking about criminal justice reform, we need to, everybody needs to look at what is happening and what can we do differently. You know, it's time to do something different at this point.
Yeah, and I agree with Doris as far as the municipalities and other places making a conscious decision to bring awareness, you know, to that this is a problem, and that, you know, how they interact with a victim, whether they believe they're a defendant or not, to really make the choice to want to know more, even if it's, you know, asking for training or inviting us training. I'm like, we'll do trainings. We'll talk to you about the program. We'll come, you know, we can do Zoom, you know, a Zoominar, webinar, and introduce the program and talk to, you know. So I think awareness is a big, would be a good way to really kind of put focus on it. So.
Well, hopefully after today, even more people will be aware of this program and will tell other people that they know, and we can try to, you know, build up support for this in other areas, in other municipalities. Another one of the questions that we have today is, should we rethink mandatory arrest laws in Washington state?
Yeah, I could talk about that for the rest of the day if people want to stay on. And Doris and I have talked about this for years. There is a legislative work group under House Bill 1517. So for the last 5 years, my unit has had people researching mandatory arrest laws nationally, and I know there's been a lot of interest in the community in rethinking this. Doris and I are part of this statewide work group where the people have been talking about it. And there's a lot of different voices involved. So if people are interested, I'm happy to share it. I've written a memo that outlines kind of the historical aspects of mandatory arrest, what a lot of the research talks about with it, and different ideas for what needs to be done to reform it, because it's not just one thing. Really what you're talking about is reimagining that moment, right? When somebody calls 911 and police respond, there's one thing that happens, right? Arrest or no arrest, and that's it. Mm-hmm. And there's one thing that police, and this is like, we can criticize police, but they're just following what the law says they have to do. And it's super detailed as to what they have to do. And if they do make an arrest, they have to hand somebody a piece of paper with a bunch of phone numbers on it. And if you've ever read the statute, you've read that piece of paper, it's pretty sad what we do for victims in that moment. And then you look at the training for law enforcement, and it's, they get some training from the initial things in the academy, but it's not recurrent. And that's a problem nationally. So I think when we look at mandatory arrest, it's a symptom of a much larger issue, which is how much do we value the services that we're providing to people when domestic violence and sexual assault is involved, right? And they've called for help, and somebody has called for help. What is our intervention at that moment? And it's a really powerful thing to start thinking about, because you realize how inadequate it is. Like, maybe it was great 41 years ago when mandatory arrest was formed, but what is it today? So I'm happy to share it, and people, and I've been talking to lots of different folks about it. There's people who want to keep mandatory arrest because they're scared about the rise in homicide, and there's people who want to take it away. But at the end of the day, we have to find a more equitable and just way to approach what is going on in these critically important cases. And I know, Doris, you've been a leader in this group and really pushing the conversation to have folks understand about criminalized survivors and the damage that causes. But we could talk about this all day.
Right. I think you kind of covered that mandate arrest. And we can,
yes,
Yeah.
Okay. Looks like some of the other questions we have, I'm not sure if maybe these have been answered, but around the protocols for prosecutor-based advocates to work with alleged defendant victims in their initial cases, how to handle notification requirements, and then related to that, what happens to their record? Is it moved from their record?
Yeah, it's a great question. And Doris, I know like one of the key parts of any of this is having advocates from the prosecutor's office be kind of empowered and focused on this issue at the front end. So when our advocates are getting cases in the door, one of the things that is on their mind is this a victim defendant? And we have a first appearance advocate. Her name's Kelsey Greer. And Kelsey is probably the person who works most closely with Survivors First to really identify cases. And then we have other advocates who are constantly looking at new cases that are coming in to make sure that good decisions are being made. And I think that process of having it be in people's consciousness is really important. We're hoping it to make it data driven, that like somebody comes in the system and then everybody automatically knows. We're not at that point yet, but I know that first impression is really important, Doris, when Kelsey's connecting to you all.
Yeah. And with Kelsey, the cases that Survivors First cases, victim defendant cases, but also victim cases, and as they are making a priority to send those cases to us. And as we are making connections, like the violence right now, and I think a lot of it has to do with COVID and quarantine, but what we have seen from the cases that the prosecutor's office have been sending, it's been some pretty violent crime stuff. And it's like, Kelsey was actually apologetic because she's like, I'm sorry for so many referrals. I'm like, no, it's unfortunate that it's that much violence out there, but we're also really happy that we will be connecting with the survivors to support them with getting their needs met and being safe. What we also see with some of the referrals, not everybody want to work with us, just to put that out there. And some people are like, no, I don't need services, but thank you for calling. And we respect that, but again, we planted the seed. And so even if they don't want services now, they allowed us enough time to describe the program and just say, if you ever need us, this is how you contact us. The resource list that we give people, it is one, very outdated, and two, it's just one has to call. By the time they tell their story 3 different times, and then they get to services that actually can support them, they have an attitude, they're mad. And I would be mad too, because I've now told my story 3, 4 times, and now I gotta tell you one more time before I get a yes. And so when we say, we get the phone, when we make the phone call and we're talking, and it's like, what are your needs? So, well, he was paying the rent. And so it's like, okay, we're gonna support that process. And right now, you know, with COVID, a lot of our people, everybody, but survivors especially, are quarantined and isolated with their abusive person. And so now it's starting, we didn't see a real big uptick at first, but we're starting to see it all the way around, and not just from Seattle, but King County and all the outskirt little cities. It is important that people understand that survivors, African-American survivors, will oftentimes fight back. We've been embedded in our minds the time that we're supposed to fight back. And it means that we don't want, you know, someone not just going to attack, and we sit there. And not to say that not all people don't do that, but that fighting back will put barriers on her safety going forward. Brittany, did you want to add something to that?
No, I think you guys, no.
Okay. You have another question?
I feel like this question is a very big question. We might not be able to answer today, but why is there no agency that survivors can call other than the police when there is an active domestic violence incident going on? Is there an agency that exists that does that? And if not, what might that look like?
Why is there no agency for survivors to call? I think, and Dave can help me with this, but domestic violence calls are, I would imagine, for law enforcement, one of the hardest calls. There's emotions involved. A lot of times there's, you know, alcohol or drugs involved. And so at one point there was a program with Seattle Police Department, the, what was it called? Help me here, Dave.
Victim support team? They still have that.
Victim support team.
Yeah.
And they would go out after law enforcement has secured the scene and work with the survivors right there on the spot. Now, that was an awesome program. It was under the city, but those were the type of services that were needed, opposed to handing them a piece of paper with 99 things on it. The advocates were able to go there and work with that family immediate needs right then and there. So as of now, that has been cut by the city, and we, you know, they don't have that service anymore. But DV calls are very, very dangerous calls. Yeah. And so we just can't show up sometimes on people's doorsteps, because it could affect the survivor and the person who's showing up. Dave, you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. And I think when we come back to what our DV laws have been for 4 decades, they've been about, we're gonna have people call 911 and we're gonna send the police. And that's what the law says. There are things like, you know, the National Dd Hotline, of course, is something that people could call. I know that there is a hotline that is going to be reforming here, probably the launch, I want to say late 2020, early 2021, that New Beginnings is going to be operating between Seattle and King County funding, and that's a big new effort. But when we look at kind of the 911 system right now, there are tens of thousands of calls that are happening to that system every year. There is no branch off of that system for, there's a DV call made, but like for mental health, or for some other things, there's a way that people can call and get different and alternative services. That's never existed for DV. Now, one of the challenges is, you know, that these are very kind of intense calls, and like, how would you do that? That needs to be built out, and that has to be part of this reimagining when law enforcement is responding, right? And how are we delivering services to people? Even this idea of like a virtual second responder when law enforcement is involved and they come, shouldn't that be a point where we're delivering services to people? We should be asking, like, what do you need? And instead of it just being the police are making this determination of arrest or no arrest, and here's your pamphlet. And that you know, that pamphlet, I mean, like, literally it says the system doesn't care. Here's a list of phone numbers. That's exactly what it says, right? And so we have to do a lot better. And I think there's a lot of ways to accomplish this. And I think that's where this question of, like, I think sometimes people are paralyzed in the mandatory arrest discussion. They're so concerned if they change it to increase homicide, or if they, you know, whatever is going to happen. And there has to be a spirit of, like, innovation, then collaboration that happens within it that hasn't been present before. And here's a great time to do it. And I think this is a great example of what you can do if you move out of paralysis to taking action.
Mm-hmm.
There was one question around if there is any specific legislation or priorities, any legislative priorities or policy recommendations coming up. And I think that you mentioned one earlier, David, but if there's anything else that our community and our supporters can help advocate for.
The Dave's question.
I think there is. I expect the legislature is going to have a bill that talks about more aggressively restoring the rights of survivors. And it's possible that this program will be involved in that. And we're going to have to see. That's a matter that Senator Manka Dhingra is leading, and something that's really important to her. But there's also the question of kind of local level issues. I know for Doris was mentioning municipalities and other people. I think just people communicating with their elected officials and with their police department to say, hey, there's this program, Survivors First. Are you referring people to that program? Right, and that's the good part about data is I can tell you who in King County has used this program and who hasn't. There has been some municipalities who have. City of Renton has sent a handful of referrals, has done a great job. There's a couple of other agencies that have as well. City of Seattle has had a handful, but there are some places that haven't. And like, maybe the question is like, why not? And then this additional question of this big move of criminal justice reform that is happening, right? It's going to be happening for the next couple of years. Where is the services for criminalized survivors? What is the plan for people to do this work, right? Because right now, that's not part of the plan. And it needs to be part of the plan. And so there's a lot of ways to approach it. I'm not saying that this is like, I have the answers to all of it. I have a lot of ideas, just like a lot of people will, but the question should be, how are we going to take action? And I think, you know, whether it's the county or whether it's the city, we spend a lot of time talking about other people who are not criminalized survivors, not talking about women in the system. Like, we need to talk about that. And this is a great starting point for that conversation. And I think it just requires the other people who are on this call to say, like, well, I'm going to go take action myself, even if it's just writing an email after this saying, I want to know what the plan is. What are you doing?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Dave.
That is really powerful. And I think we're going to get ready to wrap up today's conversation. But before we do, is there anything that any one of you would like to share with our audience today that we haven't mentioned?
One thing that I would like to put out there, that on top of October being Domestic Violence Action Month and the Week Without Violence, it is also Cancer Awareness Month. And as a survivor of myself, I say, please acknowledge that and take good care of yourselves and get that exam. That's one piece. On the other piece is that Dave and I have been talking about this project for, I want to say 3-4 years now. and to finally, like, to do it. Like, we don't want to talk about it anymore. We want to be about it, and we want to do something that supports the African American survivors and all survivors, but like I always say, focus population for those who are furthest from opportunity. And so in our communities, we need to make sure that people know, because a survivor could be anyone you're sitting next to, and you won't have a clue of all the traumas you may be sitting there with. And so we are trying to make sure that this project is acknowledged, and that survivors are making connection, not only to the survivors first, but to all of our programming that we have to support that process. And so if we move forward, you know, Dave mentioned earlier, it's like the survivors first is really the prevention piece of, let's not put them in the system in the first place, right? And so then as we are looking further down the way, and Dave and I have been having conversations of, you know, what if, you know, why don't there be some type of diversion type program? And I know with Dd community advocacy programs, you know, it's that mandate piece that we don't agree with, because we want survivors to be able to make their own choices. But what about if it's a charge that really, you know, it's a crime and it has to be charged? What would that look like to have a diversion process that says, you know, work with the Y or other agencies, and we will dismiss this case off of your record? So that is the next part to this. We are working on the prevention piece, was what we have funding for right now, but we are also looking at what would that diversion piece be for those charges that the prosecutor's office is forced to charge. And they would refer them, and we would work with them, and hopefully this will prevent them from coming back through those criminal justice doors. So if anyone has any question, my email is on there. Dave email, Bridget, Jill. We would love to talk further, because we could keep talking about it all day, but we gotta go. Did we answer all the questions, Kiza?
I believe we did answer all the questions we have here in the Q&A.
I think Tracy Orcott had one.
I think we answered all of these. I'm not seeing one from, I think there's some comments and some statements in here, but I think we got to all the questions.
Okay.
Bridget or David, is there anything that you would like to add?
Well, I just want to say that on top of, you know, all of this, Survivors First, like I said, it works. Take care of yourself. Self-care is extremely important when we're working with survivors and people who are dealing with trauma. You have to take care of yourself. And so I think that's a very important piece, so that you can continue to be successful in helping survivors, you know, through these processes. So that's my little piece.
I'll just end by saying I'm just really grateful to be able to work with the YWCA on this effort. I mean, and I've said this to other people, I think this is the most important program that I've been associated with in my time at the prosecutor's office. I've been doing DV work for decades. And this would not work without the Y doing the hard work right up front with people. We're just referring cases. But we have the easy part of it. And it's so powerful and inspiring to us to see that the work that the Y is doing to transform lives from people who have had nothing, right? They weren't empowered, you know, whether empowerment's an amazing thing, but there's a lot of people who are not empowered. They're not, for all the reasons that Doris and Bridget and others have talked about, right? So how do we help those who are not empowered? You can just wait for them to become empowered and to call you, right? And to say the right things and to get into the system that you have and meet your needs, or you can reach out to them. And I think that that ability to reach out to people with grace and cultural competence and the motivation for folks and a warm process, it's amazing and transformative. And I'm just grateful to be a part of it.
Well, thank you all for joining this presentation today. This is really powerful. This program is so exciting, and I really do hope that it is something that we're able to share wider in the community so that we can build more support for survivors. This is just one of YWCA's many programs for gender-based violence. And so I would love to encourage all of you to join us tomorrow. We're going to be hearing from several members of YWCA staff about some of the other programs that we have for survivors in our community, and for Friday for our FAQ as well, just to talk about all of the different questions that we have on the issue of gender-based violence. So thank you all for joining us today. And I hope to see you again soon. And we will be posting a recording from today's webinar on our website later this week, ywcaworks.org/WWV20. And if you follow #WWV20 online, you will find a lot of content, not just from our YWCA, but from YWCAs all across the country, really talking about gender-based violence, and some fantastic resources there as well. So I encourage all of you to continue your education and learning about this critical issue. And thank you all.
Thank you, Kiza.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.